I'm Alexa, and this is my story. I honestly think I could write a novel about all that has transpired in my life in the past year and all the things that I've learned, but let's just start with this. I call it Flattening the Nerve, a brain injury's journey through a pandemic. For most, 2020 felt like getting hit by a ton of bricks, with routine shaken and unexpected challenges. For me, it felt like getting T-boned by a car while riding a bike and hitting my head hard on the concrete. Oh wait, let me preface this by saying that I'm sharing my story to shed light on our body's power to heal itself given the right resources and how truly difficult it can be to find those resources. As I heal, I find it helpful to read stories of other people going through PCS and the ways that they try to overcome it. I also want to share the impact of head injuries because these are no freaking joke. I've put my entire timeline on my website if you want to see all the details, but let's get started. Remember, this is my story. This is what's worked for me. Everybody's different. So it's true, in January, 5 days before returning to the US after a year in 5 continents, I had a little accident. Sadly, was not wearing a helmet, and I remember the whole thing. I was biking along, the driver was pulling out of his driveway, he looked one way, he didn't look mine, and we both kept going. I hit my shoulder and behind my left ear pretty bad on the road, and the bike was super bent up too. The driver was really nice. He offered his help, and he stopped, and he oddly offered to buy me a drink too, which is the weirdest pickup scenario I've ever met. But I didn't think to go to the hospital because other than a few tears and some bruises, I honestly thought I was fine. The next few days, I continued on with my adventures as planned, and I remember being stressed, tired, and had a headache, but I had a huge bruise on my head. I just thought it was par for the course. It wasn't until about a month later where I realized I had a concussion and Post Concussion Syndrome. And ironically, my journey much mimicked that of the pandemic in Massachusetts, USA, where I eventually returned home. It's been a trying year-long journey and counting. Phase -1, February. This gonna be an issue? Although we'd begun to hear rumors that the pandemic was affecting other countries, at that point I was still questioning whether it was going to be an issue for me personally. I continued to travel throughout the US and then on to Lisbon. My plan was to live in Lisbon for a while, something I'd been looking forward to for years. But honestly, I almost didn't go. I was extremely anxious, felt like I could and did cry at any second, yet despite all warning signs, I continued on as normal. I traveled to Lisbon as we had the first set of COVID cases emerging in New York City. However, at that time, it was a lot of, nah, I'm overreacting, just stressed about what could happen and not really being realistic. Well, weren't we all in for a treat? Phase 0, March. Not looking good. Bunker down. I was in Lisbon for 6 days at the beginning of the month. I fell in love with that city all over, but I was not experiencing the same amount of joy that I had the year before. I felt really out of it, like I was living in slow motion, lightheaded upon standing, and kind of numb entirely to emotions. After one night of light drinking, I literally thought my head was going to explode from the pressure inside. On day 4, I booked a flight home. Equally as much as my body told me it was time for a reset with my family, the world told me through a vague but very immediate travel restriction that was put into place to mitigate COVID. I returned to the US before I could potentially be locked out. The subsequent 24-hour layover in Morocco was the pinnacle moment of, okay, crap is hitting the fan, take cautionary and immediate action. Now a month post-accident, I could barely see straight at dinner. I was absolutely exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. Every muscle in my body was locked, and I was unbearably terrified something would happen as a solo 24-year-old girl in a country that is far from a feminist paradise. Mind you, I had been in Morocco a year before and knew I would be fine. I just could not shake the insane anxiety. There was also, oh by the way, a mounting fear that something would happen that would change the ban for some reason, and in that next 24 hours my flight back would be cancelled and I wouldn't be able to get back to the Boston area. A few days after I returned home, I got on a telehealth appointment, and honestly, thank goodness for this doctor who at least identified what was going on. She said, well, you have all the signs and symptoms of post concussion syndrome, probably a result of the car accident. Honestly, at that point, I just assumed I was upset about transitioning back to normalcy after a year of international travel. It had never crossed my mind that my symptoms were related to my bike accident or anything else than just, oh, I don't know, coming down from the wildest year of my life in 12 countries. As Massachusetts closed everything down and went into lockdown, I too bunkered down, made changes to my routine, and for the first time in 14 months had no travel plans. Phase 1. April. Flattening the nerve. Thank you to essential workers. As the world focused on keeping COVID cases under control, I was also focused on keeping something under control, my anxiety. This phase did not make it go away by any means, as we know, but rather tried to bring it to a manageable level. We were all met with fear and uncertainty, and my personal super happy fun time Disney World shut down too. There was no fun being had. Post Concussion Syndrome, or PCS, is when typical concussion symptoms continue beyond the normal 3 to 4 week recovery window. The cause of this continuation varies greatly, but includes things like high stress, previous spine injuries, nutrient deficiencies, vestibular issues, previous concussions, and a plethora of others. High stress? Check. Previous spine injury? Check. I jumped off a cliff and fractured a vertebra about a year before in February of 2019, and now looking back, I wonder if I got a concussion then. But either way, that incident is most definitely part of my PCS story. I would say that I was maybe 30% myself at this point, not that I had any clue at that time, and supposedly people recover from PCS within 3 to 6 months, but for me it's already been 12 very headachy months. My most prominent symptom at the time involved the nervous system taking over all functions in what I can only describe as being stuck in panic all the time. To use pandemic terms, my nerves were running around buying toilet paper even though diarrhea was not the issue. My brain spent 20 minutes spraying everything with Lysol before I put it in my mouth for fear that it would make my symptoms worse. And when my heart would race from the stress, I convinced myself I had COVID, I would take my temperature and smell a candle. You feel me? Like the world, I realized the importance of essential workers. This included my naturopathic doctor, who I met in April and who is my literal hero, and who I worked with every week for the next year. My physical therapist at that time, my parents, my siblings, who came to my rescue even when I was irritable beyond belief. I foolishly thought this situation, COVID and my symptoms, would be over in a short amount of time, and like everyone, started furiously pulling together the pieces to try to understand what was going on. While the world came to know the terms social distancing and quarantine, I came to know the terms neurofatigue and proprioception, among many, many others. But neurofatigue is not an official medical term yet, but it refers to a fatigue a person experiences after a brain injury, wherein cognitive function is limited and runs out really quickly. Yes. Proprioception is a person's awareness of their body's position in space. In my case, I had a hard time, and kind of still do, trusting my footing because my body just feels really out of balance. I would walk around the house leaning on tables and counters to feel more grounded in my whereabouts. To begin to even address all of these symptoms, I immediately adopted an anti-inflammatory diet. the gut and brain are hugely connected. Unhappy gut, unhappy brain, and the other way around. So I cut out all gluten, which I already had before, dairy, corn, refined sugar, alcohol, and processed foods. I added nutrient-rich vegetables and vitamins and supplements, and I've definitely played around with diets since, as I'll talk about, but still maintain these elements now because they've been that impactful in reducing headaches and general discomfort. In conjunction, I've made sure to drink at least 64 ounces of water every day, about half my body weight, an absolute must. So, 1 second. That's good. It's worth noting that by mid-April, I was not exercising more than walks outside, a super frustration for someone who's usually very active. I also started speaking to a psychotherapist who gave me some tools for coping with anxiety. Honestly, a life-changing experience all on its own. Highly recommend. I woke up most mornings feeling like the world was spinning, and my head and body continue, honestly, to feel very disconnected from one another. I continued to work, for better or for worse, full time, remotely, and spent the rest of my time healing. Phase 2, May to June, reopening our eyes and testing. In May, America had the awakening movement of Black Lives Matter following the murder of George Floyd. Our eyes were wide open to the systemic racism that is so ingrained. Concurrently, our testing for the virus increased. In my world, a meaningless speck of nothing compared to the weight of the movement, I too had my eyes reopened through the amazing work of my naturopathic doctor. By this time in my recovery, my eyes had so much pressure behind them that I felt like a horse wearing blinders. My field of vision was just so narrow. And what helped to expand that were light touch, non-invasive therapies like orthobionomy and cranial sacral therapy. If you've never heard of those, don't worry, neither had I, but oh my goodness, I love them now. My symptoms also included eye floaters and blurred vision. Let's just say it felt like having a Zoom call with random kids running around in the background, preventing me from staying focused. As time went on, and after a few sessions, the parental neurons figured out how to keep the floater kids at bay, and now they're only an occasional distraction. It was at this time that the US had another spike in COVID cases. Alongside it, I experienced an increase in symptoms. I got a load of testing done to rule out more serious conditions, which I definitely should have done much sooner. But what caused my spike in symptoms? A brain and spine MRI, followed a few days later by an experiment with dry needling. Turns out being in a tube with loud noises blaring, tight headphones, and the cold, sterile air of a medical room did not fare well with a head injury. Though an important procedure for ruling out serious conditions, it induced total panic, and I barely made it through both exams. Lo and behold, all tests returned normal. Age-appropriate brain, and other than a compressed vertebra, which I knew about, normal spine. Grand. As for the dry needling, the therapy does serve a purpose, but not when my nervous system was so on edge and my muscles were still in spasm from the trauma. One needle in my right trapezius muscle sent shooting pain all over my head. I almost passed out and then proceeded to cry for 2 hours. As you may imagine, running the gamut of therapies and new doctors was exhausting, frustrating, and a lot of work for someone working on maybe 45% brain power. We all continued to educate ourselves on best practices for staying healthy. I spent hours reading in between lots of cognitive rest about how to disrupt a system how to reset a system that had been so disrupted. Like with the pandemic, some days were better than others. Some days prevented the false hope that we were almost done, and some days we were left questioning everything that we had ever learned and ever been taught, and I really had, let's be honest, I really at this point had no issue with social distancing because being within 6 feet of anything was overwhelming, within 6 feet of sounds was painful, and within 6 feet of light was unbearable. I enjoyed taking breaks from the news because, frankly, screen time was really difficult. Phase 3, July to August. Reopening neck and back. As the summer rolled on, pandemic restrictions started to loosen, along with my neck muscles. For some, range of motion and permission to move about the country was granted. We definitely questioned if these openings were here to stay, but time suggested they would for at least a bit. We returned to sports with restrictions, and I too started cardio exercise again under the guidance of a physical therapist who is specialized in concussions. This was a point in my recovery where exercise did more good than bad, and I could do it lightly without making my symptoms too much worse. In the long run, I needed exercise as much as kids need play. My brain needed the blood circulating and the endorphins pumping. This helped a lot. It was definitely a delicate balance of pushing my nervous system, but not to the point of fight, flight, freeze, in which I literally felt frozen because all my muscles would just lock and my head would throb. 20 minutes of light jogging, walking, or biking was my max. I continued to have a headache and felt like I had to order ahead for memories and words to come to me. Or was it that I had to go out and pick them up curbside down the road? I also had so much fatigue, as if my PPE supplies were continuously out of stock, and in addition to hand sanitizer and a mask, I carried around the new norms of blue light filter glasses and a lacrosse ball for massages. I added in a celery juice cleanse, which I still do now, and a few other supplements to naturally boost my system. As I understand it, when our body undergoes trauma, it releases all sorts of things that it had been storing away, and using my diet, I am healing from the inside out. And it's funny, well, maybe not funny. This pandemic has also revealed a whole slew of national issues, from racism to weak leadership, to our health system or lack thereof, to climate change and our food system. We all have a lot of healing to do. Phase 4, September, main reopening or brain reopening. You know that feeling when you're wearing a mask, no one can hear you, you're getting really sweaty and irritated and you want to rip it off? Where you know you're doing the right thing, but you just want the whole thing to be over. For 7 months up to this point, I felt like there was a mask between me and the rest of the world. No doctor had a singular answer, and I wanted nothing more than to have it go away. I knew I was taking the right steps in recovery and I was making progress, but the end still seemed far from view. Luckily, didn't get that sweaty. Then I met with a functional neurologist at a concussion center. And to find out what happens there, stay tuned for part 2. Thank you so much for listening. I am excited to share the rest of my journey with you. Like I mentioned before, if you're interested in seeing my full timeline, I have it up on my website. I'll link it down below. I'm also going to include some of the resources that have helped me the most in my recovery. And please do reach out if you have any questions. I'm excited to hear from you. I'm excited to start a conversation about this. It's been quite the journey so far, and it feels really good to be heard. So thank you. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna do.